Hey Bob,
Hey, how are you?
I'm well. I'm trying to see how this. It says it's streaming, and I'm just trying to see if it's actually streaming.
So, are you using the LinkedIn as
It's
well?
it says I have to use.
This.
Oh, so there's a delay. I'm on LinkedIn now, so we can go. Let me just. I'm posting it with. All right, so it's live on LinkedIn. So I'm not sure it's where it should be, but we're recording and we'll share. And I tried earlier to do it with the LinkedIn, and it just kept saying LinkedIn doesn't allow you to start a live stream in the past, and
Okay.
it had the date in the future. It had the date today's date and 11 o'clock. So
Okay.
we'll just try to figure that out later. All right.
Okay.
So welcome everybody, and I'm here with Bob Mullenbach to talk about the compliance advantage, and this is a four-part series safeguarding partnerships between banks and fintechs. This is an intro. I'm Colin Dark. I've been practicing banking and regulatory law for about 20 years. I was in-house counsel at a bank and outside counsel for banks for a long time. I do consulting work, and I have my compliance as a service technology company, ComplySun. I was also general counsel, chief compliance officer of Rocket Loans, and that is where I met Bob Mullenbach. And Bob will now introduce himself.
Well, thanks and welcome everybody. Like Colin said, I'm Bob Mullenbach, and I've been working in the financial industry probably for 3 decades now. I've held titles of chief compliance officers, worked with traditional banks, always in compliance, and also most recently compliance officer, chief compliance officer, risk, and everything at a recent um, BAS, Banking as a Service bank, which had partners. And then prior to that, I was managing director at ProBank, where I was led their compliance, fintech compliance division, going around and engaging in the sponsor banks and their fintech partners doing audits, due diligence, and all of that. So I've pretty much have seen the traditional bank side of it, the fintech side, and everything like that. So feel I have a very vast experience in past dealing within this space, and hopefully, this will be a good session and sessions to follow. So we appreciate you taking time and joining.
So, as we noted, this is the first in a four-part monthly webinar. And the next webinar will be on November 15th at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. And this will be, the Friday before the American FinTech Council's summit that following Tuesday. So, first things first, with Bob. What is a compliance management system? And this is something that is hard to define. But if you could give your initial definition of it, and then we can kind of go into just practical definitions of what a compliance system is.
Yeah, thanks, Colin. And when I think of a compliance management system, I would define it as an integrated system used to meet regulatory requirements, internal policies, and industry standards. And then if you look at an effective CMS will help organizations avoid, and which we'll get into later, avoid um, any non-compliance and achieve ongoing regulatory compliance. And I think, as I mentioned, we'll get into this a little later, the enforcement actions definitely have increased. And I wanted to note that 93% of regulatory findings or within the fintech space struggle with compliance. And over 60% of the fintech companies out there today through this year have experienced a, um, a fine of over $250,000. So 60% of the companies have experienced fines in 2024. And compliance management system helps balance that out. And the goal is to not make that list.
That's that is the goal. And I would add, this is not a check the box exercise. And a compliance system should truly be a system where you understand how it's operating and you can, um, you know, gap check it throughout the year. And when the CMS, like all the fintechs and the banks that you talk about and that you see in the news that have gotten regulatory fines, it's not because they didn't have any CMS at all. It's not because they don't have any compliance officers or they didn't get a lot of um, solid advice from outside consultants and outside attorneys. It's because of a few things. One is because it wasn't systemized enough where when there are gaps or when there's growing concerns, it's highlighted for the compliance officers, and the compliance officers have enough say in the company so that they can call it out and be taken seriously by management. And with management, the management proactively looking and paying attention and understanding, like as part of building your business and growing and scaling, you have to bring along and have compliance at the table. It's not a speed bump, and that's what I say often. It's guardrails. So you often don't even notice the guardrails as you're going down your path of building a great company. But once they're there, you know how to course correct and know how to stay on the steady line. And one big misconception, and I spoke about this last week, where executives or senior leadership will see a consent order and automatically think, well, and I've been told this by a CEO, like, well, we focus on doing the right thing. And because of that, like, we don't really have to worry as much as this group, or we wouldn't be in the same predicament as this particular company that got a consent order. And that's just not true because, like I said, they did have a CMS, all of these companies, and we're going to talk about Chime. Chime has great compliance officers, great attorneys, great internal, external resources, but it was growing gaps that they didn't pay attention to or have a system in place. So if it was one group wasn't paying attention, it would get you know escalated by another group, or the senior management on their own would have a view that's showing like, hey, there's this growing concern of complaints that either aren't being resolved or talked about timely, or they're pointing to the same type of concern with what we're doing, um, and we need to do something. So when we go through this and we talk about a compliance management system, we have a lot of tools, even at Compliance, of like how you can put in a system, but it's important to know that it's as good or as bad as senior management allows it. And for a company that's getting to financial services or any complex regulatory environment, they have to know that part of the price to pay to play is having a system in place, and that system has to continuously be viewed and continuously to be updated and monitored as the environment changes and as your company changes.
And Colin, if I may interject, you made a great point about collaboration within the company organization in the departments where, like you said, in the organizations today can have a good compliance staff, um, feel they're very compliant, implemented a CMS, but somehow a gap came up, and we'll talk about that again in just a little bit. But again, that collaboration somehow it fell through the cracks, and that would be the challenge is to fill that. And when there is a lack of communication, a lack of collaboration, that's when those type of events take place.
Yes. If ever you want to interrupt me by saying I made a good point, that's totally fine throughout.
Of course.
Otherwise, no, just kidding.
No.
Anyone can always interrupt me and we can collaborate on this and everything. All right. And we went into this, and Bob will have some more deeper insights. But this is why is the CMS important, and your primary regulator or your bank partner's primary regulator views it as important. So if it's important to them, it's going to be important to you. And Bob mentioned when you're seeing these consent orders, one of the underlying issues is a CMS. So Bob, you want to elaborate?
Sure. When you look at this area, and as Colin mentioned, the regulator expectations is number one that you do have a system that you have put in place, and then the program, which is the program states that you will be doing this, and your system is what you choose to use and to complete the program and stay up to date on the compliance program. But the expectations for the FDIC, CFPB, and state and all that, the the regulators do provide a good source, the compliance examination procedures and manuals, where they simply outline their expectations of meeting those qualifications. And again, I think a lot of folks have heard, depending on the size of the institution, you can adopt and adapt to those certain types of regulations. But the key points that you do want to have covered, um, let me get to my notes here, would be learning about the compliance responsibilities, making sure that their employees within the organization understand their roles and responsibilities as well, and that it is incorporated into the business model at all times. And one of the main, I think, weak points is the follow up, corrective action, and taking it timely. That would be a big expectation of the regulators. And I think the key parts that is expected would be the board and management oversight, ensure that you do have a compliance program. And another portion is the compliance audit, that on an annual basis, or at least an annual basis, that you would have an independent or third party audit conducted on your institution. And that may, working with your partnering bank, may be a determining factor on scope and working through that as an engagement. Now, in the Chime example, it was about refunding. They did not meet their company policy in customer refunds within a 14-day period. Now, Chime did not make a lot of statements of how it happened and why it happened, but they said that there was a system failure back in 2020 or 2021, and now they were just cited um, for this. So you have to ask yourself, as Colin said before, they have good compliance people, they have a good system in place. So how did this happen? Well, something went wrong, and it's been going on since 2020, 2021, but just being discovered now and working through that process. And earlier in the year, um, the state of California Department of Financial Institution also found an issue with Chime. So this is not their first infraction for the year. So that again goes into deeper concern of how a couple of items may have fallen through the cracks, even though they do have a good program and good compliance folks. But the regulators do have high expectations, and I think there is a big, still today, a knowledge gap of the bank, traditional bank, and also the fintech about how they measure up. And a lot of the fintechs today are saying still they're not a bank, they're not a financial institution, which is correct. But the regulators do expect and will hold the bank sponsor um, very accountable to uphold the regulations and be
Yeah,
held accountable. And that is one of the main factors in communicating with the fintech partners, the importance of that.
right. And I would say this shows too that the fintech partner can and will be held accountable as well, versus, the bank may have the oversight, but then the entity getting the complaint and the entity that has the processes in place is just, you can't hide behind the bank and the bank's regulatory team or the bank's compliance team. It's got to be part of your team, like the bank, the partner bank, and the fintech. Especially if the fintech is consumer facing, they're a team. Like they're one and the same, basically, in respect to like ensuring that there are systems in place to capture and resolve growing concerns, growing complaints. One of the bigger sources for any regulatory action, and like one of their expectations, is that if there are complaints, if there's an uptick in complaints, the entity getting like being complained about has a process to quickly resolve them. And that is a gap where, and there was a gap with Chime, like in the period that Bob talked about, they had like 1,400 complaints filed against them. So that just tells me that if these complaints are continuing, and this might have been a time of um, huge growth for them, and that them and their partners, because their product was good and people were enjoying it. And if there's huge growth and scale, one of the issues with that is you might have a compliance team, and this is again why there should be automated systems and technology. You might have a compliance team that's really good for a company at one particular size, but then when it scales rapidly, you don't have enough people, and you try to outsource it, you try to hire, but then outsourcing is difficult because they don't understand the nuances internally at the company. And then hiring is great, but it still takes time to onboard. So with complaints in particular, when those aren't being resolved, it does show to me that it could be a lack of training, and that's always going to be a critical component of any uh, compliance management system. And I would say like a lack of board oversight, lack of audits, because this uptick in complaints and this regular topic of complaints should have flagged something, so it should have been resolved. And it does look like it was resolved after this, but then it got to the point where it was on the radar of state and federal regulators. And while they don't have this expectation of you can't have a foot fault, you can't um, um, have any issues with your compliance standards, they do require prompt remedial action. They do require doing the root cause analysis. So if the root cause, you're getting these complaints by not returning funds quickly, and then the Department of Financial Protection and Innovation in California, there was a separate consent order earlier this year in February, and that was about the complaints and not responding and not having a process in place to respond to those complaints. So if that is to the point where it's a year, it's 1,400 some complaints or more in a particular time period, it's getting to the point where you're scaling and not having a system in place where it's causing consumer harm. And if it's causing consumer harm, the regulators are going to get involved and going to push to ensure you have processes in place so this stops. And that just reminds me, and Bob could elaborate on this too, of one of the regulator expectations is you work with the regulator. So when a regulator sends a civil investigation demand or just an inquiry, it's important to tell your compliance story. And if part of your story was you show, hey, we had these complaints, we responded based on the tier. Some of these were consumer harm complaints. We responded timely, and then we got to the root cause. The root cause was we didn't have good enough training. Our procedures were off in terms of what would be expected of, like, if there's a technology failure that's getting a human consumer complaint, and we resolved it. Then you have a conversation of how did you resolve it? Okay, what are other processes we could put in place? What are other expectations we can set for the company so this doesn't happen again? And they're regulatory compliance professionals too, the ones that are coming to kind of talk through what is going on the ground at the company. And they 9 out of 10 times will work with you, and they will understand, where there are headaches and where there are matters you can't quickly resolve. But they don't understand, like, if there's a growing matter and you ignore it. And like, if you ignore it, that right away they will come down hard, or at least have that mindset. And similarly, like, if you can't tell your compliance story, and this is the issue with having everything in PDFs and Excel sheets and only looking at it annually. So annually, or like when you're doing due diligence, or when a regulator comes, which is absolutely the last time. So when your compliance team is overworked and over, like, stretched, so they're putting out fires every day, and your management is focused on building the business, you don't have a process in place to step back to ensure that there's monitoring and testing going on so that the CMS is doing what you think it's doing. And that is, for the tech folks, that's like tech debt. So as the company's growing, compliance issues come up and get resolved daily or weekly. And then, a couple of years go by, hopefully not that much, but you haven't stepped back to kind of look at your system. You haven't had an audit, which, is by its nature looking backwards versus being proactive. Then you don't really have anyone in your company that can confidently describe and show how the compliance system is operating. And the longer it takes for them to put together, a presentation and to print out, like, here's how everybody took these classes, here's the reminders of how important it is to take, here's the things that happen if they don't take the classes, here's the things that happen if they don't review the policies. And we do it annually, which it should be broken up throughout the year. But it will take companies weeks or months to kind of put together the whole presentation. And with every passing like hour, the regulators getting more and more suspicious that you didn't have anything really working, and you were kind of asleep at the wheel, which might not be the case. And on the ground, you have talented people that were doing the right thing, but you know, your system's only as good as you can tell your story. And if you can't tell your story, the regulators going to be suspicious and will probably come down hard on you, to then put in a consent order that here are the steps you have to take so that we know and you can tell us how you're actually not causing consumer harm and how you have these core elements of a CMS.
Well, Colin, again, you bring up a lot of good points. Um, you spend quite a bit of time talking about self identification. And when the regulators come in, and you mentioned another great point of being able to tell your story. And when the regulator comes in, they can tell right away and read you, because normally it's face to face, whether you're being truthful and honest and checking out your CMS. And how they do that is they will first start to look at your complaints. And I'm sure that most of the folks on the phone, in part of this, will understand a majority of the findings come from consumer complaints. And then they'll get into your response, whether that was appropriate, timely, and all of that. But then they will look at your um, action plan that you created. What was the root cause? Knowledge, skills, discipline, or resources. What did you do to implement? Where are you on that? Proving to the regulator that identify you identified it within your organization. So your compliance system is working, but what have you done since then? Have you corrected it, or is it 50% implemented? What's the status? And if you can tell, like Colin said, tell your story and have the documentation to back that up, it's more than likely that, that they will understand you and have that trust factor going forward. And that's the proof that you will want to show that you do have a system in place that is working. This is why it happened. Here's what we're doing to correct it, and to not happen again. But the worst thing is if a regulator comes in and you have no knowledge of it. You're unaware of the situation at hand through lack of monitoring, lack of having audits done, and that whole lack of self identification.
Yeah. So this goes over again a lot of what we just talked about. And it's, you need board and management oversight. And that's one we can go into a little deeper, because we did talk about, the core elements are board and management oversight, the fact that you have a compliance program, which, isn't necessarily a technology, like we're offering technology, but it's a components of what we're talking about, the policies and procedures, the training, the complaint management system. And again, like that system is tracking and resolving these complaints based on a policy. And then Bob mentioned a couple times, I think, the compliance audits. So often, especially with a smaller company, it's going to be an annual audit, and then you get a good bill of health or not. And that's kind of scary in the sense that if there's a growing concern and it's been a year since you had this stepping back and having this robust audit done by professionals, you have a year of liability that hopefully, they are finding things that your internal team already found and mitigated, and they just give tips on how to mitigate them better or how to have a different process for flagging them, versus they come up with something brand new that you didn't know about, that had been growing, and then you have to figure out how to resolve it and how to make sure it doesn't happen again. So you do want part of your internal team, so this is for the bank and the fintech. You want a monitoring and testing team that is going to schedule and make sure your complaint management system is working how it should, timely responses, doing the root cause analysis, and also, escalating to board and management. And that's often just having a presentation quarterly or monthly, to your board and management, kind of giving them a report card of how the company's doing and if there's any growing concerns, growing risks. And if there are growing concerns, growing risk, having a plan of how you're going to, you know, close that gap and do better and like make sure that the growing concerns are being mitigated, so that the company doesn't have to stop building. Bob, any other thoughts on just kind of?
Yeah, when you mentioned you started off with the board oversight, which is appropriate because ultimately the board is responsible for anything and everything. And one of the, I guess, key points that I would like to make is, in my experience, one of the biggest responsibilities of the board of directors is assigning a compliance officer up front, early on in the process, on the onboarding, the due diligence, is to ensure that a compliance officer has been appointed and a compliance staff is being developed. I believe that is so critical, and a lot of times we will find that a compliance officer, initially a full-time dedicated compliance officer, has not been done, in that they're in the process of hiring somebody, or there's a consultant, which I've done in the past, temporary consultant coming in to relieve that compliance officer duties to hire staff and all of that, which is fine, but that needs to be completed promptly up front, is to build that compliance team for the following reasons why we've already covered. That's one point that I want to make, that compliance assigning and appointing a compliance officer and working on the compliance team is critical from start to finish.
And the CEO, the executives have to listen to the compliance officer. That it's a core part of the team. Like there might be other industries where a compliance officer isn't a core part of the team, but fintech, banking, financial services is not one of them. It is an expectation of the regulators. It's an expectation of having a healthy, growing company that sits in this, fiduciary intermediary role of people in their finances in particular, especially in Chime. And that was one of the concerns, where there were individuals that weren't able to get the funds that they needed. And because of that placement of trust in your fintech, in your bank, in your financial institution, these rules are in place and for a reason. And it's often after, the Great Recession, obviously a bunch of rules went into place because as a governmental entity, as a society, you see like harm and things that have happened when some people were, the hands were off the wheel. And we put, say what you want about government, but the government puts in place what they think is necessary to mitigate this. And there are a lot of great things that come from government working well. I do think, and and I'm a very pro business individual, and part of why I've done well in companies is because I see the business case and I'm focused on helping the business run. But I also, have that balance of knowing how important, um, regulatory oversight is, and the CFPB coming up with the complaint process is something that has helped consumers, and it's helped compliance officers, because even if you don't want to give them enough authority or respect on occasion, and I've been lucky enough to work for places that really understood the importance of compliance. If there's a place that doesn't, like, you can point to the CFPB, and you can point to the complaint database, and give yourself an additional weight of making sure a root cause is actually identified, and making sure that steps are taken to really fix the problem so that it's not a bigger problem. And that's, it wasn't there before. There were, like, you could talk about attorney generals, and you could talk about other state regulators to a degree, but since the CFPB, it's been more of a understanding of the importance of compliance, especially at financial institutions.
Well, and Colin, to expand on that, I know we're probably running short on time, but earlier I provided a statistic that 60% of the fintech companies had experienced fines of in excess of 250,000. And if you trace it back, it's probably due to lack of resources based on getting compliance involved early on in the due diligence process and all of that. But with the 250 fine, if appropriate resources and funds are invested in compliance up front, you wouldn't have that reputational risk. You also have to think of the investors too. Would you rather spend that 250 on investing in your compliance program, not make the news, not be fined, um, in good standing as far as reputational risks for our customers and the institutions and with our investors?
And that's often overlooked, where especially for, like, sometimes like a smaller fintech, it's the investors that have like, are buying loans or investing in the company or the fintech. There's a lot of third parties, not kind of the key focus I'm talking that we flagged there, third party, but third parties that are involved in kind of these complex bank and fintech relationships, and they understand the financial risk that corresponds with reputational risk, that corresponds with not doing the right thing. So often when they visit fintech, for example, their first focus is on the compliance management system and the legal and compliance team. It's not about capital markets. It's not about just the pure executive team. It's making sure that their investment is going to be protected in the future, and that's having a compliance and legal team. So it's often not what a company wants to spend a lot of time talking about and pitching, but it's something that shows that you're mature and understand the industry you're getting into. And we put that, like, it makes sense to talk about that with the board oversight, because that's often they're looking at growth and they want the company to succeed. Mature boards, you want a board member that has kind of had the experience of working within a bank or working within a heavily regulated industry, so that they have the, you know, battle scars of knowing that when you don't pay attention, or when you don't give enough resources, and they're never like crazy resources, and it's just that often companies see it as a cost center, the compliance and legal department, versus just a cost that's required for doing business. Um, and so when you have a mature board, or at least a few members on that board that understand and have been in the trenches, they're going to tell you, and they're going to support, giving authority and resources to your compliance team. Do you have any other thoughts, Bob, on the board's role?
Um, no, I think that's a great point of the obtaining buy-in, and it always goes back to a point made early on in my career. Compliance does not bring revenue, but compliance saves the negative press. If you look at that, it's just a matter of you'll pay me now or you'll pay me later. And it's that choice that needs to be made. You invest the 250 in compliance and you continue to develop that team. And as Colin said, hopefully a few of the board members are very experienced and understand that whole business model. Where, if you invest now and early, and keep yourselves out of the press, and it all goes back to priorities. And there's often a lot of times there's clashes between business development and compliance. And a philosophy I've always had from going from traditional bank and now getting into the fintech space is usually compliance is the no folks. Oh gosh, we don't want to go and talk to compliance. They're going to say no. And over the years, I've seen more with fintechs and even with regulators, they need to be more flexible in understanding the business and the business models and looking at the intent. Is it, consumer harm and all that? But it all goes back to especially compliance departments and chief compliance officer. When somebody brings you something, not always have a flat no, but how can we make this work in a compliant manner where it doesn't look like UDAP, where it doesn't look like this, advertising, all of that. And so I think that, on the compliance side, folks can do some work there too. And with that stigma out there that compliance are always the bad people, and we always go there, and they're the ones to blame that we can't get our business development goals met and all of that. So, but it's real. I mean, that relationship or that tension is out there. It's real today. It goes up to senior management and the board. Normally compliance is last on the agenda at board meetings. And, it's something out there that we all need to deal with. But I think that comes with our professionalism, our knowledge, and going back to the point that we're here to protect the investment. We're here to protect the bank. We're here to protect the fintech. And the more that you can identify that, and especially with all the consent orders coming up, I always go back to, pay me now or pay me later. And, those are examples now that I hope that the board of directors, senior management, and compliance and business, and we talked a lot earlier about collaboration within departments, that hopefully everybody will be getting and gaining a little bit more, I don't want to say respect, but understanding the importance of communicating, of why we want to do this, why we want to do that. But in closing, I feel that, we on the compliance side probably can do a little better job of when things are brought to the Department of Compliance to not have that negative attitude all up front. It's say, okay, you've got this. Thanks for bringing it to me. Let's see how we can make things work. And I think that is really a tribute to folks in the institution, organizations not getting compliance involved up front, that they're going to put the brakes on immediately. And that's where you see that, uh, compliance may, the deal signed, the term sheet signed, everything else. But if compliance would have been invited to early meetings, you could actually be further down the line in addressing issues, whether it's on the website, marketing, product concerns, and all of that. So I think there's a big portion out there that um, the collaboration can be definitely improved and worked upon within a lot of different departments. And compliance in and of itself, I feel um, can do a better job of that and be the leader of an organization and bringing that to a forefront and resolution.
Yeah, sorry about that. My dog just started going crazy. So
Well, welcome to the party.
the lies here. A couple of things I just wanted to make a point of was one. I had this mentor, still a mentor, who was general counsel at Rocket Mortgage and the Rocket Companies, and he would always say there was a ism at the Rocket Companies of yes before no, and so when you're in that role and you're doing compliance and legal, the business development, the marketing team would be like, yeah, but yes before no. And he added his own, like the legal compliance ism would be no KNOW before
Hmm.
yes, and then yes before no.
Yep.
So some of it is just like ensuring that the business development, the management, everybody understands what would happen if you take certain steps or you ignore certain steps or you do a process. So that's like you're making an informed decision versus just thinking legal compliance is being frustrating. And the more you say, like no, KNOW, it's triggering a conversation you have with business development, and that will help, or marketing. And once you start going like, what's the end goal? What's the reason you want to take this approach? What things can we put in place? And if you have a compliance officer that's in, or legal counsel that's been in the industry or seen a lot of things, they can give examples of things that do work, that don't raise the flag of regulatory scrutiny. And that just starting that conversation, you have a collaborative environment, so you have better results. And when we talk about you pay now or you pay later, this is like you continue to grow and you get to keep your money. You keep the profits and the revenue versus having to give it back because you're going too quick and you're ignoring kind of the ground rules. All right, so now we have like 10 minutes, and we can go over just some of the Chime case, uh, and we have been touching on it throughout. And I, I don't know, Bob, if you want to kind of highlight some of the observations you had, especially with the CFPB case consent order.
Yeah, and again, I think it goes back to, we do not know all the facts within this, but again, it goes back to what we've stressed on this call is self-identification and proving that you do have the knowledge, the ability, the resources, and also stress and again use these examples of the investment into um, a healthy compliance program, whether that's in-house attorneys, compliance officers, chief compliance officers, and implementing that strong CMS and document, what you're doing as far as monitoring, and like Colin said earlier, be able to tell your compliance story and tell the true story. And the regulators, I think, a lot of folks are critical of the regulators, and I mean, I get that. Colin and I get that. But we also have a responsibility to tell our story, protect the institution. And, when you're looking at regulations over 200 plus years, um, and then having this new space being introduced, and a lot of the regulators being the traditional banking audit mode, and they look at that with a lens of, hey, traditional banking. But I think the more and more that they get involved and hear the stories of the fintech, that looking at the consumer harm and maybe a different lens, instead of having that negative um, premise right away and up front, but really learn the story and the history of the fintech, what their business model is, and again, going back to the attitude of not being the always a no person, but how this, and then again, I mean, anything and everything today could be thrown into the UDAP bucket and how things are viewed. So, a bit of advice in past is think in advance of your product and what you're providing to the consumer, and how that could be perceived as potential consumer harm. And I I know within the compliance department, part of your goal and objective should be to be able to know that something is going to be addressed, brought up, and you need to be able to, as Colin said earlier, to tell your story and back that. And I think that goes into key lessons. I'll just go back to what Colin said: be able to tell your story and what you've identified, what you've done about it. If there's resource issues, what's it look like? Are you in the process of hiring? But just be well up to date and well versed. And one thing that you look at it a couple ways. That some folks will say, when an exam is taking place, they don't want their staff talking to a regulator. They don't want this. They don't want this. And they just want one person to deal with a regulator. That gives off a couple different signals to regulators. One, what are they hiding? Why do they not want these folks to talk to us? Where if a well prepared, well trained, well educated compliance staff and senior management believe in a culture of compliance, we should get to that point where it doesn't matter if they talk to a compliance analyst, because you believe in your product, you believe in the team, and you believe and honestly, deep down, you believe you're doing the right thing and being able to tell that story.
Yeah, and in line with that, and in line with like having a way to tell your compliance story and why that's so critically important, is as part of your process. And when we talked about you needing to step back and um, review the compliance management system periodically versus just annually, it's doing a retro or doing dry runs, so that like you have, like I mentioned earlier, like compliance team is operations team that are like putting out little fires every day. If you're in a complicated company, a complicated fintech financial services, there's a lot of little fires that go off every day because it's complicated. You're dealing with people, you're dealing with finances. There's a lot that can go wrong, and there's like little issues that will pop up. But part of learning and growing a mature organization is using those opportunities as learning opportunities, doing a retro for your team, for the operations people that were involved, and for management, and like senior management, where you're giving that monthly update of here's what happened, here's how we responded, here's how we talk about it, here's what systems are in place to understand what happened, how we flagged it, how we mitigated it, or this is how we didn't find out about this until XYZ happened. Based on that, we did this root cause. And you're talking about it, and you're having these mature analytical frameworks to walk through what the system's doing and why it's doing what it's doing. And if you're doing that throughout the year and you're really taking advantage of the little issues that happen, when the big issues happen, you're prepared and they're not going to be, devastating to shut down the company. It's going to be, you're going to know how to respond. Your team's going to know respond if you're not there, and you're going to be a healthier company and you're saving the company's reputation because you have a system in place. That's with this too, with the systems. It's just some of the these like elements that we talked about, but it's we often see companies will create PDFs of their policies, review them annually, and it's just the CEO or executive reviews all the policies all at once annually. Same with training. You have to have training for various aspects of your company, and you push it in so it's all at once. And same with monitoring and auditing. It's often just auditing once a year and try to get it in all at once. And just like what's that? It's a horrible saying, but like, how do you eat an elephant? Like one little bite at a time. Like you break it. Shouldn't eat elephants, but you like breaking down complicated tasks so that it's less daunting. And that's with like your compliance system. You should break it down so that it's a weekly, monthly exercise, and that's the same with the retros. And that it's less daunting and actually has more of an impact versus remembering it at the end of the year and then giving it priority, or at the beginning of the year and then giving it priority because an auditor said to, or one of the investors, or due diligence or something.
Well, how many times do you review a training document and it's due by the end of the year, and 90% of the training is done the last week of the year? So, I mean, regulators, they'll easily identify that as how serious are you? Is it you're just doing it to check box? And I know we're short on time, but I mean, those are things are very easily identifiable by regulators.
Right. Right.
Okay.
And it's, yeah, you're not fooling anyone. And it's like
Yeah.
every company does it.
Yeah.
So when
Yeah.
that's the other thing. You want to be less interesting than the other guy. So when every company does it, but then you have a process in place and you break it up throughout the year, it's going to be super refreshing for a regulator. So you're not going to be that interesting and they're not going to be that suspicious. So they're going to go on to, the next fintech, the next bank down the line.
Yep.
Well, I just want to thank everybody for tuning in, and we will shoot people the slides and break up this live into little bite-sized videos, and we'll give more information about the next webinar in the coming week. And again, thank you for participating. It's Bob, it's always good to talk with you and kind of flag issues for fintechs and banks alike.
Thank you. Glad to be a part of it. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.